The train whistle cut through the Arizona heat like a blade. Owen stood on the platform, a ghost in his own town. Men in Tombstone saw an Apache, a relic of a war they'd won. They didn't see a man hollowed out by silence, a rancher watching his land die of thirst. He'd sent a letter east, a desperate shot in the dark. He'd asked for a wife. Not for love, he'd buried that with his family long ago. He'd asked for a partner, someone plain, someone sturdy, someone who wouldn't break under the weight of this God-forsaken land. He needed hands to help him survive. That's all. The train hissed to a stop, black smoke choking the sky. Salesmen and families spilled out. And then he saw her. She paused at the top of the steps, a gloved hand on the rail. The entire platform went quiet. This was not the woman he'd asked for. She wasn't plain. She wasn't sturdy. She was beautiful, with a kind of dangerous grace that pulled every eye in the crowd. Her hair was chestnut, pinned beneath a modest hat. But there was nothing modest about the way she held herself. Her dress was simple gray, but on her it looked like silk. He had asked for someone to disappear with him into the dust. The agency had sent him a spectacle. She descended the steps, her chin high, carrying a single trunk. Her eyes, the color of a storm brewing over the mountains, scanned the crowd and landed on him. She didn't flinch from the stares, the whispers that were already starting to buzz like flies. She walked straight to him, her path unwavering. "You're Mr. Owen?" she asked. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried a chilling lack of emotion. He just nodded, his own voice lost somewhere in his throat. "I am," he managed to say. "I am Hope Donovan." The whispers behind them swelled. "She's too fine for him. No woman comes west unless she's running from something. Mark my words, that girl brings trouble." Owen reached for her trunk, his calloused hand brushing hers. A jolt, like lightning on a dry day, passed between them. He lifted the heavy trunk and turned toward his wagon, not saying another word. She followed, her back ramrod straight, ignoring the venomous whispers of the town. She stepped onto the wagon seat with a quiet dignity that felt more like a shield. He climbed up beside her, clicked the reins, and the wagon rolled forward, leaving the prying eyes of Tombstone behind. The road was 15 miles of dust and silence. The sun beat down, relentless. Owen could feel her presence beside him, a still, cold center in the blistering heat. He glanced at her profile, at the perfect line of her jaw. What secrets had driven a woman like her to answer a letter from a broken Apache rancher on the edge of the world? "It is not what you expected," he finally said, his voice rough from disuse. He gestured at the cracked earth, the skeletal mesquite trees. She didn't look at the land. She kept her eyes fixed on the wavering horizon. "I expected nothing," she replied, her voice as flat and empty as the desert around them. "Expectations are luxuries I can no longer afford." The words hit him harder than the sun. He nodded once, and the silence returned, heavier than before. When his homestead finally came into view, the weathered cabin, the sagging barn, the goat pen, she leaned forward slightly, studying it. Her face gave nothing away. No disappointment, no fear, no relief. Nothing. "There it is," Owen said. "It is very quiet," she murmured. "Lonely," he corrected, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. She turned her storm-colored eyes to him then, and a flicker of something he couldn't name moved in their depths. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "lonely is what a person needs." He looked away, urging the horses on. He didn't understand her words, but he felt their weight. It wasn't a comfort. It was a warning. When they stopped, she was down from the wagon before he could offer a hand. She stood in the yard, taking it all in. The cracked soil, the barren garden patch, the bleating of the handful of goats, their ribs showing through their hides. He carried her trunk to the porch. "I'll show you inside." The cabin was one room with a smaller sleeping area curtained off. A table, 2 chairs, a few tin dishes. It was clean, but it was the home of a man who had forgotten how to live. She moved through the space, her sharp gaze missing nothing, but her face remained a perfect, unreadable mask. "It is small," he said, half apologizing. "It is shelter," she answered, and he knew then that for her, the two things were not the same. That evening she made a meal of beans and cornmeal. They ate in a silence that was louder than any conversation. The lamplight cast shadows on the rough-hewn walls, making the small cabin feel like a cage. She sat across from him, her posture perfect, as if she were dining in a grand hall instead of a dusty shack at the end of the world. But her eyes held a darkness that the lamplight couldn't touch. When the meal was over, she set her spoon down with a soft click. "We should be clear, Mr. Owen," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "I did not come seeking romance. I came seeking survival. If we are to live as partners, I will do my part. I ask the same of you." Her words were the echo of his own letter, but hearing them from her lips felt like a judgment. He inclined his head. "That is what I asked." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "It has been a long journey, if you'll excuse me." She disappeared behind the curtain into the small sleeping space. He heard the faint rustle of her unpacking, the creak of floorboards, ordinary sounds that made the cabin feel even emptier than before. Owen sat for a long time, staring at the flickering flame of the lamp. He had wanted plain, he had wanted simple, instead he had hope, and he was beginning to realize that hope was the most complicated thing he had ever known. Outside, the wind howled, and it sounded like it was whispering a name he didn't want to hear. The first days passed in a tense, quiet rhythm. Each morning, Owen would rise before dawn and head out to the goats, only to return to the smell of coffee brewing on the stove. She had found his small stash and made it without asking, a simple act that felt like a claim. She learned the chores by watching, her movements efficient and precise. She never complained. She never asked for help. By the second day, she had taken over the cooking completely. "You'll work better with a full belly," she stated, not as a suggestion, but as a fact. The goats, usually wary of strangers, accepted her touch with a strange calm. Owen watched her from the barn, a knot tightening in his gut. She was too good at this, too prepared. It wasn't the tentative adaptation of a city woman. It was the practiced skill of someone who knew how to survive on the run. At night, they sat at the table, the silence stretching between them. She asked about Tombstone, about neighbors, her questions sharp and practical. He answered in short, clipped sentences. They were two strangers sharing a roof, bound by a contract neither of them fully understood. On the fourth evening, the desert decided to break them. The sky, which had been a merciless blue for months, turned a bruised purple. The air grew thick, heavy, and still. Hope stood on the porch, her hand shading her eyes as she looked to the horizon. "Rain?" she asked. Owen came to stand beside her, his gaze sweeping the unnatural clouds. His chest tightened. "More than rain," he said. The storm hit with the force of an explosion. Wind tore across the plains, ripping at the roof of the cabin. Then came the rain, not in drops, but in solid sheets that hammered the earth, turning the baked dust into a sucking, greedy mud. Thunder cracked overhead, and lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, illuminating a world gone mad. The dry wash behind the barn, a dusty scar on the landscape for years, transformed into a roaring, brown river in a matter of minutes. Then they heard it, the terrified bleating of the goats. Water was pouring into the corral, rising with terrifying speed. The animals panicked, scrambling over each other, their eyes wide with terror. Owen didn't hesitate. He ran, his boots sinking into the thick mud. He didn't expect her to follow, but she was right behind him, her face set, her eyes blazing with a fierce light he'd never seen before. "Drive them uphill!" he shouted over the roar of the water. They waded into the churning corral, the icy water soaking them to the bone. Owen grabbed the nearest goat, shoving it toward the gate. Hope, her skirts heavy with mud and water, clapped her hands, her voice sharp and commanding as she herded the panicked animals. They worked in a desperate, unspoken rhythm, a frantic dance against the rising tide. But the water was too fast. A small kid, trapped against the far fence, let out a thin, terrified cry as the current swept it off its feet. Without a single thought, Hope lunged. She plunged her arms into the swirling, muddy water, her hands searching blindly. She caught the kid, pulling it tight against her chest. But the force of the current was too strong. It dragged her backward, her feet slipping in the treacherous mud. "Hope!" Owen yelled, his voice raw with a sudden, sharp fear. He reached her just as she was about to go under, his hand clamping around her arm. He pulled, using all his strength to drag them both back from the edge. They stumbled clear of the corral, the rescued kid trembling in her arms. The last of the goats scrambled to higher ground just as the corral fence splintered and washed away. The barn groaned, a wall collapsing under the weight of the torrent. Drenched, mud-caked, and breathless, they stood on a rocky outcrop, the rain still pounding down on them, the saved herd huddled behind them. Hope sank to the ground, the kid still clutched in her arms. A single choked laugh escaped her lips, half shock, half relief. As she leaned forward, pressing her cheek to the kid's wet fur, her sodden dress pulled tight across her back. And Owen saw it. The fabric had torn near her waist, and tucked into a hidden belt was a small oilskin pouch. It was heavy, weighted down, and through the tear he could see the unmistakable edge of stacked banknotes. A lot of them. More money than a woman answering a matrimonial ad should ever have. The bond they had just forged in the heart of the storm shattered. The fear he had felt for her safety curdled into a cold, hard suspicion. She wasn't just running from something, she was running with something, and she had brought it right to his door. After the storm, the desert was a different world. The air smelled of life, of wet sage and damp earth. But the homestead was a wreck. The corral was gone, the barn was damaged, and a thick layer of mud coated everything. For days they worked to repair the damage, moving in a new, heavy silence. The easy rhythm they'd found in the flood was gone, replaced by the tense quiet of suspicion. Owen watched her every move. He saw the way she instinctively checked the horizon, the way she flinched at the sound of a horse in the distance, and he thought of the money she kept hidden, a secret she carried like a weapon. The trust that had started to grow between them was poisoned. He no longer saw a partner. He saw a liability. After 2 weeks, their supplies were dangerously low. "We have to go to Tombstone," he said, his voice flat. Hope looked up from the garden plot she was trying to salvage. "I'll come with you," she said. It wasn't a question. "If I hide here, the town will talk worse. Better they see me beside you." He didn't want her beside him. He wanted answers. But he nodded, knowing she was right. The ride into town was a silent battle of wills. He could feel her watching him, sensing his distrust. When they arrived, Main Street went quiet. Faces turned in doorways. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The whispers followed them like a plague. Hope sat tall, her face a stoic mask. But Owen could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. In the general store, a man with a dusty bowler hat and tired eyes was talking to the owner. Owen caught a few words. "Woman from back east, chestnut hair, traveling alone." The man looked up, his eyes sweeping over Hope for a fraction of a second too long before he turned and left the store. A chill went down Owen's spine. Coincidence? Or was the trouble he'd seen in her eyes finally catching up to them? As they loaded their supplies, one of the Garrison brothers, a lout who made a sport of baiting Owen, swaggered over. "Well, looky here, Chief," he sneered, his eyes raking over Hope. "Heard you got yourself a pretty little mail order. She running from the law or just a bad husband?" Before Owen could react, Hope stepped forward. "I'm running from ignorance," she said, her voice like ice. "But it seems I didn't run far enough." The Garrison brother's face turned red. He took a step toward her, but Owen was suddenly there, between them, his hand resting near the axe handle in the back of the wagon. The man backed down, muttering threats, and stomped away. The ride home was even more silent than the ride in. The encounter had sharpened the edge between them. He had defended her, but it felt like he was defending his own bad judgment. He thought the worst was over, that the gossip and the stares were the price they had to pay. He was wrong. The worst was just getting started. A week later, a stranger rode into their yard. He wasn't a prospector or a rancher. He sat on a glossy black thoroughbred, and his clothes, a fine black coat despite the heat, were worth more than Owen's entire homestead. He dismounted with an easy arrogance, his pale, cold eyes taking in the repaired barn, the struggling garden, before they settled on Owen. "You would be Owen," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly chilling. Owen stood silent, his hand gripping the handle of the shovel he'd been using. The man smiled, a tight, unpleasant stretching of his lips. "Edward McGrath, from Missouri." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Before Owen could process the words, the cabin door opened. Hope stepped out, a pail of water in her hand. The moment her eyes landed on McGrath, all the color drained from her face. The pail slipped from her grasp, spilling water into the dust. The mask of calm she wore so perfectly shattered into a million pieces, revealing a raw, pure terror that stole Owen's breath. Hello, Hope, McGrath said, his voice dripping with false pleasantry. You led me quite a chase. You have no right to be here, Hope whispered, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. McGrath's smile widened. On the contrary, my dear. He reached into his coat and produced a folded legal document. Your father, a man of expensive tastes and poor luck, owed me a significant sum. $15,000 to be exact. He let the number hang in the air, a staggering amount of money. Before his unfortunate demise, he signed this contract, binding you to me in settlement of that debt. That makes you mine. Hope stared at him, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. I am no one's property, she said, her voice cracking. The law disagrees, McGrath purred. Contracts are binding, and you, my dear, committed fraud when you ran before our marriage could be finalized. Owen took a step forward, the shovel held like a weapon. She is my wife now. McGrath barely glanced at him. Wife? Hardly. A desperate arrangement with a man the law barely recognizes as a citizen. It won't stand up in any real court. He turned his cold eyes back to Hope. Your father offered you. I accepted. That's how business is done. Leave this land, Owen said, his voice a low growl. McGrath's pleasant facade finally slipped. His eyes narrowed into slits of ice. Careful, Apache. I have friends in this territory, judges, sheriffs, men who respect law and money far more than they respect you. Don't make a mistake that costs you what little you have. The threat was clear. He wasn't just here for Hope. He was here to destroy everything. To prove a point, he drew a small, silver-plated pistol from his coat. He aimed it not at Owen, but at the small kid Hope had rescued from the flood, now grazing peacefully near the barn. Before anyone could move, he fired. The crack of the pistol echoed across the silent yard. The kid dropped, a dark stain spreading on its white coat. Hope screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure agony. This is just property, McGrath said calmly, smoke curling from the barrel of his pistol. So is she. He swung back into his saddle, his black horse dancing nervously. I'll be back in 3 days. With the sheriff. Have her ready. He spurred his horse and galloped away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the deafening silence of a world that had just ended. Hope collapsed to her knees, her hands covering her mouth, her body racked with silent, tearing sobs. Owen stood frozen, the dead goat at his feet, the stranger's chilling words echoing in his head. I believe you have something that belongs to me. And for the first time, Owen was terrified he was right. The silence that followed McGrath's departure was worse than the gunshot. It was a dead, heavy thing, filled with the ghost of the man's words. Hope knelt in the dust, her gaze fixed on the small, still body of the goat. Owen felt a rage so cold and sharp it threatened to split him in two. He had fought soldiers. He had survived disease and starvation, but he had never felt this powerless. He finally moved, crossing the yard to crouch beside her. He expected her to flinch, to pull away, but she just looked up at him, her storm gray eyes hollowed out by terror. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice a raw scrape. He doesn't just ruin people, he destroys them. There was another girl. Her father had debts too. She tried to run. They found her body in the Missouri River a month later. They called it an accident. The story sent a shard of ice through Owen's heart. This wasn't about a debt. It was about possession, about a man who believed he could own a human soul. You are not going back, Owen said, his voice a vow. How can you stop him? She asked, a desperate, broken sound. He has money. He has the law. He has men who will do whatever he asks. You have this. She gestured around at the small, struggling ranch. A handful of goats and a piece of land no one else wants. He will take you down with me. Without thinking, he reached for her, pulling her against his chest. She was stiff at first, then she collapsed against him, her body trembling uncontrollably. I hid behind my grief for years, he said, his voice thick, speaking the truth aloud for the first time. I used it as an excuse to stop living. But you woke something up in me. I will not let him take that. I will not let him take you. She pulled back, searching his face, and in that moment, the wall between them crumbled. They were no longer a rancher and his mail-order bride. They were two people trapped in a storm, clinging to each other for survival. Word of McGrath's visit hit Tombstone like a lit match on dry grass. The story twisted and grew with every telling. The rich banker from back east, the runaway bride, the savage Apache holding her hostage. By the second morning, Sheriff Harris rode out to the homestead, his face grim. McGrath's got the whole town in an uproar, the sheriff said, not dismounting. He's filed papers, waving that contract around. Judge Wallace has called a hearing for tomorrow morning. You both need to be there. Owen's jaw clenched. A hearing? It's his word against hers. The sheriff sighed, his eyes full of a weary resignation. It's more than that, Owen. It's his money against your situation. The judge is a stickler for contracts. Right now, the law's on McGrath's side. I'm just telling you to be prepared. The unspoken message was clear. The law was not going to save them. Hope, who had been standing silently in the doorway, stepped out onto the porch. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a new, defiant fire. We'll be there, she said. That night, the cabin felt smaller than ever. The threat of the next day pressed in on them, suffocating them. They sat at the table, the untouched food growing cold. He will win, Hope said, her voice flat. He always wins. Owen looked at her, at the strength that had carried her across a continent, that had faced down a flash flood, that had stood up to the scorn of an entire town. He would not let that strength be broken. No, he said, the idea hitting him with the force of a physical blow. There is one way, one thing that might matter more to the judge than a contract from Missouri. Hope looked at him, confused. What? A contract of our own, Owen said, his eyes locking with hers. Here, in this territory, a marriage. Her eyes widened in shock. He'll call it a sham, a fraud to cheat him. Let him, Owen said, a grim determination settling over him. It's our only chance. We have to go now, tonight, to Reverend Wallace. She stared at him for a long moment, the full weight of his desperate gamble sinking in. Then she slowly nodded. All right, she whispered. Let's go get married. They rode through the night, the desert landscape lit by a sliver of moon. Reaching Tombstone before dawn, they went straight to the Reverend's small house behind the church. They woke him from his sleep, a stern, unyielding man who looked at them with deep suspicion. Owen explained their situation, his words stark and honest. The Reverend listened, his face impassive, his hand resting on the heavy Bible on his nightstand. You are asking me to sanctify a union born of desperation and deceit, the Reverend said, his voice cold, to use a holy sacrament as a legal trick. I am asking you to help a woman who will be dragged into slavery or death if you do not. Owen countered, his voice low and intense. Is that not a holy act? The Reverend was silent for a long time, his eyes moving from Owen's hard-scarred face to Hope's pale, desperate one. He was about to refuse. Owen could see it in his eyes. But then there was a knock on the door. It was Sheriff Harris. He'd seen their wagon. Reverend, the sheriff said, stepping inside. I know what this looks like, but I also know what I saw in Ed McGrath's eyes. It wasn't justice. It was something ugly. Sometimes the law ain't enough to make things right. The sheriff looked at the Reverend, his gaze steady. Do the ceremony. I'll sign as the witness. The Reverend looked from the lawman to the two desperate people before him, and something in his rigid certainty seemed to break. He let out a long, slow breath and nodded once. May God have mercy on all our souls, he said, and reached for his Bible. The courtroom was packed. Every soul in Tombstone, it seemed, had come to see the spectacle. The air was thick with sweat and judgment. McGrath sat at the front, smug and confident, his expensive lawyer from Tucson beside him. He looked like a man who had already won. Owen and Hope sat opposite them, a wide, empty space around them, as if they were contagious. The judge, a stern man with eyes like chips of flint, banged his gavel, and a heavy silence fell over the room. "We are here to hear the claim of Mr. Edward McGrath against Miss Hope Donovan," the judge announced. "Speak plain." McGrath stood, his voice smooth and practiced, and laid out his case. He presented the contract, signed by Hope's father. He spoke of the debt, of Hope's flight, of fraud. His lawyer chimed in with points of law from Missouri, his words weaving a legal cage around Hope. It was a masterful performance. Then it was Hope's turn. She rose, her hands trembling, but her voice, when it came, was clear and strong. "That contract was made without my consent," she said, her voice ringing through the silent room. "My father's debt was his, not mine. Mr. McGrath did not seek to settle a debt. He sought to buy a person. I refused to be owned." A murmur went through the crowd. Some women nodded in sympathy. Others looked scandalized. McGrath just smiled, unconcerned. Then Owen stood. From his vest, he pulled a single folded piece of paper. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "this morning at dawn, Reverend Wallace married us. Sheriff Harris was the witness. Under the laws of this territory, she is my wife." He handed the marriage license to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. The room erupted in chaos. McGrath shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "A sham! A fraud!" he screamed. "This is a pathetic trick to cheat me of what is rightfully mine." His lawyer was quick. "Your Honor, this so-called marriage is a clear attempt to circumvent a prior legal obligation. The contract predates this union. It must be honored." The judge looked at the marriage license, then at the contract, his face unreadable. The room held its breath. It felt like an eternity. Owen could see the doubt in the judge's eyes. The lawyer was right. A last-minute marriage did look like a trick. The judge seemed to be leaning McGrath's way. He picked up his gavel, ready to make his ruling. All hope seemed to drain from the room. But just as the gavel was about to fall, a small voice cut through the tension. "He's lying." Every head turned. Standing near the back was Mrs. Henderson's daughter, the quiet girl who had always watched Hope with a strange mix of fear and admiration. She was trembling, but she stood her ground. I I was serving drinks at the saloon last night," she stammered, her voice growing stronger with every word. "I heard Mr. McGrath talking to his lawyer. He was bragging." The girl took a deep breath. He said, He said Hope's father never signed that contract. He said her father died before he could, so Mr. McGrath forged his signature. He laughed about it. He said he'd done it before. He called it acquiring assets." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. McGrath's face had gone white as a sheet. His lawyer was frantically trying to shut the girl up, but it was too late. Before the judge could even react, another voice boomed from the doorway. "That's all I needed to hear." It was the man from the general store, the man with the dusty bowler hat. But he wasn't just a drifter. He flipped open his coat, revealing the badge of a Pinkerton detective. "Edward McGrath," the detective said, his voice like iron. "You're under arrest, not for debt collection, for fraud, forgery, and human trafficking. I've been hunting you for 6 months, ever since a girl's body washed up in the Missouri River." Justice had arrived, not in the form of a judge's gavel, but from the courage of a quiet girl and the relentless pursuit of a lawman in disguise. McGrath, the man who had held all the power, suddenly had none. The sheriff moved in, clamping irons on his wrists. The crowd, which had been ready to condemn Hope, now turned on McGrath with a furious roar. The case was dismissed. The nightmare was over. As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright Arizona sun, the world felt different. The people of Tombstone looked at them not with scorn or suspicion, but with a new grudging respect. They hadn't just seen a trial, they had seen a monster unmasked, and they had seen the two people who had refused to back down from him. The ride home was quiet, but it was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of strangers, or of suspicion, or of fear. It was the silence of two people who had walked through fire together and come out the other side. They had been married as a desperate gamble, a legal trick. But standing there, under the wide open sky, it felt like the truest thing in the world. The weeks that followed were like the slow, deep breath after a long run. The shadow of McGrath was gone, and in its place, life began to take root. Hope's touch transformed the homestead. She planted a garden that, against all odds, began to thrive. She sewed curtains from old flour sacks, bringing a softness to the harsh lines of the cabin. The small space, once a monument to Owen's grief, began to feel like a home. The town changed, too. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid them now stopped by with offerings: a basket of flour from a shamefaced Mrs. Henderson, a side of venison from a prospector. They were no longer the Apache and the runaway. They were Owen and Hope, the people who had faced down the devil and won. One evening as the sun set, painting the mountains in hues of gold and crimson, they stood on the porch, watching the sky burn. The desert was still a hard, unforgiving place, but it was their place. Hope slipped her hand into his. "Every choice I made, every mile I ran, it all led me here," she said quietly. "I don't regret any of it." He turned his rough, scarred hand to hold hers, the words coming to him easier than they ever had before. "I love you," he said. She smiled, a real, true smile that reached her storm-gray eyes and filled them with light. "And I love you, Owen," she said, "not for saving me, but for standing with me." He lifted her into his arms right there on the porch and carried her inside. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a sanctuary. The desert would always test them. Droughts would come, and storms would rage. But they had faced the worst of the human heart and had not broken. They had found each other in the dust and the silence, and together they had found a way to make the desert bloom. Thank you for staying with me through Owen and Hope's incredible journey. If their story of courage and survival touched your heart, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It means the world to me and helps me bring more stories like this to you. I'll see you in the next one.